The English Civil War in the mid-17th century resulted in the execution of a king and his house in exile, but the turmoil that followed would lead Parliament to restore the kingship of England. This is the history of Charles II. Charles II was born at St James's Palace on the 29th of May 1630, the eldest surviving son of Charles I, King of England, Scotland and Ireland, and his wife Henrietta Maria, sister of Louis XIII of France. Charles was their second child, the first being a son born about a year before, who died within a day. Charles was baptised on the 27th of June in the Chapel Royal by William Laud, a future Archbishop of Canterbury, and during his infancy was supervised by the Protestant Countess of Dorset. At birth, Charles automatically became Duke of Cornwall and Duke of Rothesay, along with several other titles. Around his 8th birthday, he was designated Prince of Wales, though he was never formally invested. In August 1642, the long-running dispute between his father and Parliament culminated in the outbreak of the First English Civil War. In October, Charles and his younger brother James were present at the Battle of Edge Hill and spent the next 2 years based in the royalist capital of Oxford. By spring 1646, most of the region had been occupied by parliamentarian forces, and Charles went into exile to avoid capture. From Falmouth, he went to the Isle of Sicily, then to Jersey and finally to France, where his mother was already living under the protection of his first cousin, the 8-year-old Louis XIV. During the Second English Civil War in 1648, Charles moved to The Hague, where his sister Mary and his brother-in-law William II, Prince of Orange, seemed more likely to provide substantial aid to the royalist cause than his mother's French relations. Although part of the French parliamentarian fleet defected, it did not reach Scotland in time to join up with the royalist Engager army led by the Duke of Hamilton before it was defeated at Preston by the New Model Army. At The Hague, Charles had a brief affair with Lucy Walter, who later falsely claimed that they were secretly married. Her son, James Croft, who became the Duke of Monmouth, was one of Charles's many illegitimate children who became prominent in British society. Despite Charles's diplomatic efforts to save his father, the execution of Charles I took place in January 1649, and England became a republic. On the 5th of February, the Covenanter Parliament of Scotland proclaimed Charles II King of Great Britain, France and Ireland at the Millcat Cross, Edinburgh, but refused to allow him to enter Scotland unless he agreed to establish a Presbyterianism as a state religion in all 3 of his kingdoms. When negotiations with the Scots stalled, Charles authorised Lord Montrose to land in the Orkney Islands with a small army to threaten the Scots with invasion, in hope of forcing an agreement more to his liking. Montrose feared that Charles would accept a compromise, and so chose to invade mainland Scotland anyway. He was captured and executed. Charles reluctantly promised that he would abide by the terms of a treaty agreed between him and the Scots Parliament at Breda, and support the Solemn League and Covenant, which authorised Presbyterian church governance across Britain. Upon his arrival in Scotland on the 23rd of June 1650, he formally agreed to the Covenant. His abandonment of Episcopal church governance, although winning him the support in Scotland, left him unpopular in England. His coronation led to the Anglo-Scottish War, and on the 3rd of September 1650, the Covenanters were defeated at Dunbar by a much smaller force commanded by Oliver Cromwell. Nevertheless, the Scots remained Charles's best hope of restoration, and he was crowned King of Scotland at Scone Abbey on the 1st of January 1651. With Cromwell's forces threatening Charles' position in Scotland, it was decided to mount an attack on England, but many of their most experienced soldiers had been excluded on religious grounds by the Kirk Party, whose leaders also refused to participate, among them Lord Argyll. Opposition to what was primarily a Scottish army meant few English royalists joined as it moved south, and the invasion ended in defeat at the Battle of Worcester on the 3rd of September 1651. Charles managed to escape, and after 6 weeks landed in Normandy on the 16th of October, despite a reward of £1,000 being on his head, risk of death for anyone caught helping him, and the difficulty in disguising him, who, at over 6 foot, was unusually tall for the time. Under the instrument of government passed by Parliament, Cromwell was appointed Lord Protector of England, Scotland and Ireland in 1653, effectively placing the British Isles under military rule. Charles lived a life of leisure at Saint-Germain-en-Laye near Paris, living on a grant from Louis XIV of 600 livres a month. Charles could not obtain sufficient finance or support to mount a serious challenge to Cromwell's government. Despite the Stuart family's connections through Henrietta Maria and the Princess of Orange, France and the Dutch Republic allied themselves with Cromwell's government from 1654, forcing Charles to leave France and turn for aid to Spain, which at that time ruled the southern Netherlands. After the death of Cromwell in 1658, Charles's initial chances of regaining the crown seemed slim. Cromwell was succeeded as Lord Protector by his son, Richard. However, the new Lord Protector had little experience in either military or civil administration. In 1659, the Rump Parliament was called and Richard resigned. During the civil and military unrest that followed, George Monk, the Governor of Scotland, was concerned that the nation would descend into anarchy. Monk and his army marched into the City of London and forced the Rump Parliament to re-admit members of the Long Parliament who had been excluded in December 1648. During Pride's Purge, Parliament dissolved itself and there was a general election for the first time in almost 20 years. The restrictions against royalist candidates and voters were widely ignored, and the elections resulted in a House of Commons that was fairly evenly divided on political grounds between royalists and parliamentarians, and on religious grounds between Anglicans and Presbyterians. The new so-called Convention Parliament assembled on the 25th of April 1660, and soon afterwards welcomed the Declaration of Breda, in which Charles promised lenience and tolerance. There would be liberty of conscience, and Anglican church policy would not be harsh. He would not exile past enemies nor confiscate their wealth. There would be pardons for nearly all his opponents except the regicides. Above all, Charles promised to rule in cooperation with Parliament. The English Parliament resolved to proclaim Charles King and invite him to return, a message that reached Charles on the 8th of May 1660. Charles set out for England, arriving in Dover on the 25th of May 1660, and reached London on the 29th of May, his 30th birthday. Although Charles and Parliament granted amnesty to nearly all of Cromwell's supporters, 50 people were specifically excluded. In the end, 9 of the regicides were executed. They were hung, drawn and quartered, whereas others were given life imprisonments or simply excluded from office for life. The bodies of Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton and John Bradshaw were subject to an indignity of posthumous decapitations. The English Parliament granted Charles an annual income to run the government of £1.2 million, generated largely from customs and excise duties. The grant, however, proved to be insufficient for most of Charles's reign. For the most part, the actual revenue was much lower, which led to attempts to economise at court by reducing the size and expenses of the royal household, and raise money through unpopular innovations such as the half tax. Charles was formally crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 23rd of April 1661. The Restoration was accompanied by social change. Puritanism lost its momentum, and theatres reopened after having been closed during the protectorship of Oliver Cromwell. Bawdy Restoration comedy became a recognisable genre. Theatre licences granted by Charles required that female parts be played by their natural performers, rather than by boys as was often the practice before, and Restoration literature celebrated or reacted to the restored court, which included libertines such as John Wilmot, 2nd Earl of Rochester. Of Charles II, Wilmot supposedly said, "We have a pretty witty king, whose word no man relies on. He never said a foolish thing, and never did a wise one." During Charles's reign, science and art flourished, but in 1665 the Great Plague of London began, peaking in September with up to 7,000 deaths per week. Charles, his family and his court fled London in July to Salisbury. Parliament then met in Oxford. Plague cases ebbed over winter, and Charles returned to London in February 1666. After a long spell of hot and dry weather through mid-1666, the Great Fire of London started on the 2nd of September in Pudding Lane. Fanned by strong winds and fed by wood and fuel stockpiled for winter, the fire destroyed thousands of houses and 87 churches, including St Paul's Cathedral. Charles and his brother James joined and directed the firefighting effort. The public blamed Catholic conspirators for the fire. In 1670, Charles entered into the Treaty of Dover, an alliance with his cousin King Louis XIV of France. Louis agreed to aid him in the Third Anglo-Dutch War and pay him a pension, and Charles secretly promised to convert to Catholicism at an unspecified future date. Charles attempted to reintroduce religious freedoms for Catholics and Protestants with his 1672 Royal Declaration of Indulgence, but the English Parliament forced him to withdraw it. In 1679, Titus Oates' revelations of a supposed popish plot sparked the exclusion crisis when it was revealed that Charles's brother and heir presumptive, James, Duke of York, had become a Catholic. The crisis saw the birth of the pro-exclusion Whig and anti-exclusion Tory parties. Charles sided with the Tories, and after the discovery of the Rye House plot to murder Charles and James in 1683, some Whig leaders were executed or forced into exile. Charles dissolved the English Parliament in 1681. Charles suffered a sudden apoplectic fit on the morning of 2nd of February 1685, and died 4 days later at the Palace of Whitehall, aged just 54. On his deathbed, Charles asked his brother James to look after his mistresses, be well to Portsmouth, and let not poor Nelly starve. He told his courtiers, "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a time dying," and expressed regret at his treatment of his wife. On the last evening of his life, he was received into the Catholic Church in the presence of Father John Huddleston, though the extent to which he was fully conscious or committed, and with whom the idea originated, is unclear. He was buried in Westminster Abbey without any manner of pomp on the 14th of February. Charles II is considered one of the most popular English kings, known as the Merry Monarch. He acknowledged at least 12 illegitimate children, but had no legitimate children, and was succeeded by his brother, James.